Some people are pointing out that the storming of the U.S. Capitol sounds kind of familiar. It sounds a bit like something we saw a few years ago here in Oregon, not to the same scale, but something similar. I'm sure you remember when armed extremists took over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge near Burns. That actually happened 5 years ago this week. After Wednesday's insurrection, a conservation group called the Center for Western Priorities put out a statement calling the Malheur occupation a dress rehearsal for what happened at the Capitol. We talked to the deputy director about that.
There is a straight line from what happened at Malheur 5 years ago this week to what we saw in Washington. Many of the same groups that were there, the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, those folks were in Washington taking over the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to overthrow the election of Joe Biden. And everything that we have seen these groups advocating for, claiming that public lands don't belong to all Americans. This is a through line that they have carried forward these last 5 years, and they have been encouraged and emboldened by President Trump and the Trump administration.
Now, I also wanted to get the opinion of someone who studies extremist groups. So I asked sociologist Randy Blazak about the connection between the Malheur occupation and what we witnessed in Washington, D.C.
That occupation is completely a part of this model of the patriot militia movement, the anti-government movement that is distrustful of federal authorities. In this case, it was the Bureau of Land Management that was the target, and that the people on a local level are the sovereign citizens, which is a term that they use, are the sort of the local authority that should be followed. And when the federal government goes too far in their authority, the people have a right to step in and take that authority back. And so they were a part of that. They are a part of that because those folks are still there in, working in this sort of subculture of anti-government rhetoric.
Like I mentioned a moment ago, that occupation started 5 years ago this week. So why don't we take a look back in the KGW Vault of when we sent Pat Doris to cover the standoff.
Steve and Dwight Hammond walked back into federal prison today in California to finish 5-year prison terms for arson. Many here in Burns are outraged because the pair were originally sentenced to much shorter terms, but the federal government appealed and now they must finish all 5 years. Many people think it's a heavy-handed move by the federal government, including the head of the Burns City Council.
I empathize with the Hammonds. I'm sorry for their situation. I think the heavy-handed, from the federal government, but they haven't made it about that.
They are the armed protesters. They marched through Burns Saturday, then some broke off and took over the visitor center at the Malheur National Wildlife Sanctuary south of town. The group is led by Amond Bundy, a Nevada rancher whose father is famous for battling the federal government over land issues. He has said they represent regular Americans who are being abused by an oppressive federal government.
Our purpose, as we have shown, is to restore and defend the Constitution.
You said you were here to help the citizens of Harney County. That help ended when a peaceful protest became an armed occupation.
Today, the Harney County Sheriff, elected by those citizens, sent a public message to Bundy and the others.
The Hammonds have turned themselves in. It's time for you to leave our community, go home to your families, and end this peacefully.
City Council leader Dan Hoke agreed it is time for the group to move on. He said many in town are frightened.
We have concern for safety. We've got people being followed. We've got them parking outside of houses, not just law enforcement, but those who are against their cause, parking and intimidating. And I'd like to see them go away.
Well, they didn't go away, and they continued occupying that wildlife refuge for more than a month. You might remember the standoff turned deadly when a group went to meet with a sheriff in the next county and their caravan got stopped by the FBI. Lavoy Finicum was shot and killed, and Amon Bundy and his brother Ryan were arrested. 27 people were charged, but the Bundys and other leaders of the occupation were eventually acquitted.